Hey, good morning, Northeast. So good to be here with you. If you're online, welcome. We're glad that you're joining us there as well. If you're new here or if you haven't been here since Easter, we're in this series called Bad Religion. Bad Religion. And kind of the idea or the premise is that we can take anything, people like you and I and others, people can take anything that was meant to be good, supposed to be good, and we can mess it up. Take cake, for instance. How can you mess up cake? I'll tell you. You could put carrots in it. That's how you can mess up a cake. I don't know if somebody was feeling bad about their diet and they thought the best way to eat vegetables was to put them in their cake. I don't know what was happening there, but they took something good and made something bad out of it. Or watermelon. How do you mess up watermelon? It's fantastic. It's refreshing when it's hot outside. This is how you mess it up. You put salt on it. That's those people. We're talking about you. You're the reason we're all here today if you put salt on your watermelon. Or how about the greatest football team of all time? We could all agree, Dallas Cowboys, right? Greatest team. We could agree on that. Yeah. Meet Jerry Jones. There you go. That's enough said. Maybe we'll win a championship Sunday. I don't know. We can also take, and here's really the point, we could also take a good faith, something that was supposed to be good for society, something that was meant to be generous, merciful, something that was supposed to do justice or bring justice, something that was supposed to create areas of grace and compassion and goodness. We could even take something like a good faith, and we can make it into a bad religion. And that's the point of the series, and that's what we're talking about today, is that whenever we take a good faith and we have the wrong priorities, we begin to take the big things and make them into the small things, or we begin to look at the minutia of the faith, that we make it into a bad religion. So we'll be in Matthew chapter 23, verse 23. We'll go through to 24, just two verses in Matthew, but I promise it is some heavy-hitting, meaningful verses as we look at how bad religion prioritizes rules over mercy, performance over people, and power over justice. And if you're tired of a bad religion, Jesus was too. And so you could join with me in Matthew chapter 23, verse 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, which are justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, yet you swallow a camel. The Pharisees at the time Jesus is addressing these religious leaders. And the first thing that he points out is that they are blind guides. See, they were the leaders, and an important part of leadership that we all know is that a leader has to know where they're going in order for somebody to follow them there. And what he's saying is, listen, you've lost a vision for God's kingdom. You're completely forgetting the things that matter, which are being merciful and doing justice and being faithful to God. They had become pros at missing the point. And one of the ways that they've done this, it has to do not so much with their giving, but with their heart, that they were following the letter of the law, but they were missing the heart of the law. They lived in this agrarian society, and part of the expectation of the Jewish law was that they would give a portion or a tithe out of everything that was raised out of their land on their fields or from their trees, that they would give a portion of that back to God, and it was an act of generosity as well as a way of obedience. So they'd give a portion of that back to God by bringing it to the temple, which allowed the temple to continue to function by teaching the Word of God and making a place of worship and a place that people can encounter God. And so they were doing that, apparently. And so Jesus doesn't condemn that. He says, continue to do those things. Continue to give that way. But apparently, they were not just giving what was expected of them, they were going above and beyond. He's going, you give even herbs from your kitchen, which were items that weren't expected or required or asked for in the law. And imagine for a moment, if you would, that you decide that this is a church that you want to be a participant in every way. You're like, this is my people, this is my group, I want to participate in every way. And one of the ways I want to do so is through giving. I want to be generous as well as obedient to God. So you begin to give to the church. And then you show up with your McCormick spice rack. And then we go, that's not really necessary or wanted. And that's kind of the point that Jesus is making here. He's going, you're so focused on the law that you're adding your own levels to it, but you're completely missing the bigger thing, which is to be compassionate, to be merciful, to do justice, to be faithful to God. You're missing the weightier matters completely. And then he gives this illustration. He goes, it's as if you are trying not to swallow a gnat, yet you are swallowing a camel. And we would go, oh, that kind of makes sense, but there's levels to it that we don't know at first glance. I don't know if you're really familiar with camels. I don't know if you know a lot about dietary restrictions of the Jewish people of the kosher diet. But once you understand a bit more about it, you understand a bit more of what Jesus is addressing here. See, the dietary laws acted a lot like a menu. There was things that were on the menu, things that you were allowed to eat or acceptable to eat. Those were called the clean things, and then there were things that weren't on the menu. If it's not on the menu, you're not supposed to eat it. And there was kind of three main reasons why. The animals that were often not on the menu were animals that were likely to carry diseases. So there's this practical reason, largely for many of the items. We would look at that and go, yeah, with those types of animals, we have to be careful on how we cook them and prepare them, lest we get ill and sick. And so there's just this really practical reason to the dietary laws. But there was also, it was a reflection of obedience, that they were giving something up in order to obey the direction that God was giving them. And then the third and the final one is that that the Jewish people were supposed to be a people that were set apart. They were different than other groups of people. They were the chosen people of God, and because of that, they lived differently, both in character as well as conduct. And these are one of those conduct issues where they're saying, listen, you're going to look differently, act differently, you're going to be a beacon of hope, and so one of those is you're going to have different dietary menu items, and what they would say is there were unclean and clean things. And here's the thing that we know, we are what we eat. Our body literally becomes the things we eat. So their understanding was if we eat something that's unclean, we literally become unclean people. And the point that Jesus is making is that you're focused on the smallest thing. See, because what would happen is wine was a common beverage in the time of ancient Palestine. And what would happen is gnats would fly into the wine barrels. And in order not to swallow a gnat, they would strain out the gnats before they poured a cup in order that their body doesn't become infected by it. And so Jesus' point is, look, you're straining out gnats, but you're swallowing camels whole. You're so worried about the minutia of the law, yet you are ignoring the bigger matters of it. Think of it as scales. On one side of the scale, you have herbs. And on the other side, you have compassion and mercy and justice, being faithful to God. They were so focused on the small parts of the law that they were beginning to miss the bigger parts of the law. And as Jesus continued to point them to the bigger parts of the law are to love the Lord your God with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. And how do you love the Lord your God? You are faithful to him. And how do you love your neighbor? You show mercy and you do justice. Yesterday, we were sitting at our dinner table, and Emily was telling the kids that we had a family service. All the kids would be together with the parents, and we'd worship together, we'd learn together, and that I was teaching this Sunday. And Charlotte, our 7-year-old, goes, "What are you teaching about?" I said, "Mercy and justice." And she didn't say nothing. I said, do you know what that means? And she said, no, I don't know what that means. I said, well, justice or mercy is basically showing compassion or kindness to somebody in their time of need. And justice is setting things right or being part of setting things right in somebody's life. And she goes, okay. And she goes, you know, when you guys are teaching, when you adults are teaching, a lot of times we don't understand, so you should tell stories. I'm like, makes sense. That's what Jesus did. Like, we didn't understand. He told us stories. And she's like, I really like it whenever you guys tell stories about kids. It makes a lot more sense to me. And then I went into their room that night, and her sister were sitting on the floor, and they were praying that I would tell a story about kids. So I couldn't let them down. So we have to tell a story about kids. And here's, last minute, I'm like, what is a story about kids that has to do with mercy and justice? And so I remember growing up. When I was growing up, I was homeschooled. And there was a moment where I had to go back to public school, and I was so nervous. I was so anxious. Because the whole time, it's been me and my mom and my sister. That's it. Now there's these teachers, there's these other kids that are there. I don't know if people are going to be nice. I don't know where to eat my lunch. I don't know how to find my classroom. I don't know. Like, I'm overwhelmed. And the first time I show up, I had a good reason to be scared because I was lost. Like, I remember the second day that I was at school, I ate in the library because I didn't know where to sit. And so I sat by myself in the library. The third day that I went to school, everything changed. Everything got quite a bit better. And the reason was there was this kid, I remember my mom dropping me off, and I'm just standing there. I, again, am like in culture shock. And there's this kid that walks up to me. His name's Theodore Macaluso. What a fantastic name, Theodore Macaluso. Him and I would become great friends. We would chug 2 liters of Mountain Dew to see who could burp the loudest. Like, that's what good friends do, right? And I remember he walked up to me, and he goes, hey, are you new? And I go, I am. And he goes, are you nervous? I'm really nervous. And he's like, let me show you around. He showed me around. And he's like, sit with me during lunch. And I sat with him during lunch. And when we were at PE, he's like, oh, the coach is kind of mean, but you just have to do this, and then he'll leave you alone. And one of the things that I found is that mercy and justice aren't always these grand gestures. That sometimes they're the simple, ordinary acts of inviting somebody to the table, of seeing somebody when they need a friend, of being compassionate when somebody needs compassion. And that's kind of the point that Jesus is making here, is he's like, you're making it into a checklist, and you're missing the point entirely. And it's easy for us to look at this critique, this time that Jesus is getting on to the Pharisees, and we're like, yeah, get him, Jesus. He's always getting on the Pharisees, and we're always like, those Pharisees. But the truth is, there's a Pharisee that lives in all of us. It's part of this human condition that often we make our own priorities. Often we miss the point. We can choose legalism over compassion and completely miss the heart of the matter. And I think the reason is because legalism is simple, but compassion is complicated. And the reason why is because legalism is about systems and rules that we can observe and we could check off the list, and we don't even need God's help for legalism to obey the rules. But compassion, mercy, justice, it's about people. And people are messy, and circumstances are complex. And because of that, we get so caught up in trivial matters, and we miss the people completely, adding our own levels of rules to follow, majoring on the minors. And here's the problem. When we major on the minors, we also minor on the majors. At Northeast, and in an attempt, as we recognize that truth in people, and as an attempt to be a community of something different, we have this value. We say it's a hill that we're willing to die on. It's a primary truth for us as a church in our culture. We often say in essentials, unity, and non-essentials, charity, and in all things, in Jesus Christ. It's our priorities. We discuss it every time we have membership classes, every time we have an Explore Northeast. We talk about our priorities. And what we're saying is that we're not going to divide on social or political ideals. We're not going to divide on preferred styles of worship, preferred styles of methods of ministry. We're not going to divide on the gray areas of doctrine. We're not. We're going to. In fact, we believe, or I believe, that when the church divides over these things, it grieves the heart of God. It doesn't mean that we're anti-intellectual. It doesn't mean that we're not willing to have those hard conversations about hard subjects or to discuss these gray areas of doctrines. That's not what it means at all. What it means is that when Jesus said that the world will know us by our union together and our love for one another, we believe that he really meant that. So we believe that we should major on our major convictions, that those are non-negotiables, that we're never going to compromise the truth of the gospel. But we also choose to be gracious and compassionate and curious towards others in those gray, minor areas so that we could love each other as Christ called us to. We've chosen to focus on the weightier matters. And according to Jesus, those weightier matters, those priorities, are to do justice, to be merciful, and to be faithful to God. As Jesus is correcting the Pharisees, this language, this isn't the first time they would have heard this. In fact, 700 years before Jesus said this, and part of in their scrolls was a prophet named Micah. And Micah said something almost identical, and then Jesus is going, remember this. Micah said in Micah 6:8, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. See, the people of God have always supposed to be in a relationship with God, to walk humbly with him, to be faithful to him. Also, to reflect the character of God. And the character of God is just and mercy. That's the character of God. And the people of God are always intended to be a reflection of that. And so when Micah tells us to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly, and Jesus says, listen, you're swallowing a camel when you miss it. When you miss it, you're not focusing on the weightier things. So what I would like us to do with the rest of our time is just to look at three aspects, practical ways of how we are to do justice and to love mercy. How are we supposed to do justice and love mercy in order that we are faithful to God, that we walk humbly with him? How do we love our neighbors? How do we love others as ourselves? The first point is that we reject passive religion and are intentionally active. We reject passive religion and are intentionally active. The Hebrew word in the Old Testament for justice is mishpat. And mishpat is used over 400 times, over 420 times. And it's used in a variety, a large array of ways, talking about God as his character as just, him bringing justice, God's people to be a place of justice. And any time that the word justice is used for the people of God, it's almost always used in the active tense, which means that it's almost always used that we aren't just in our way of thinking, but that we literally bring justice to other people. That when something isn't right, that we get involved and make things right. That was a cornerstone of the people of God back to the very beginning of when Abraham was chosen in that covenant as a chosen people. This term is especially emphasizes care for the most vulnerable people. So it often say, do justice, and also don't forget the widow, the orphan, and it's usually either the sojourner or the immigrant. A lot of times it's translated depending on the context and the translation. So don't forget those people who have been marginalized in society because they need justice as much, if not more, than anybody else. Jesus talked about justice and mercy a lot as well. We see it in today's passage. It's the primary point of what Jesus is talking about today. But he also told stories about it because stories are the best way for us to understand oftentimes. And one of the best known stories about Jesus teaching on mercy and justice comes from the Good Samaritan. Maybe you know this story, or maybe you don't. And if you don't, it goes something like this, that Jesus is sitting amongst a group of people, and there's a legal scholar amongst them. And the scholar says, Jesus is teaching them, how do you love your neighbor, and how do you love God? And those are the greatest commandments. And the scholar goes, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus goes, that's the question. Let me tell you who your neighbor is. So he begins to tell the story of a man that's on a journey from Jerusalem to Jericho. And along that route, he gets mugged and beat up. And everybody that's listening goes, of course he did. Like, that's just a bad area of the country. Like, that's a hard place to be. And so Jesus goes, and then as the man's laying there, he's naked, he doesn't have anything, he's been robbed, he might be dead, this priest starts walking by, and everybody just waits to find out what the priest is going to do. And then Jesus goes, the priest just kept walking. And they go, oh, man. And he's like, I know. And then he goes, but there's this Levite that comes. And everybody goes, oh, Levites are good. And they go, well, he ignored him too. And he just kept walking as well. And then Jesus goes, but then there was this Samaritan. Everybody goes, oh, great, a Samaritan. Because they know they're the sworn enemies of the Jewish people. But he says, the Samaritan, as he was walking by, this Jew that laid there, naked and in need of help, that he had compassion on him. And that he cared for his needs, he gave him clothes, he put him on his donkey, he took him into town, and he funded his recovery. And as Jesus stops telling the story, he looks around the room and he says, which of these do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell amongst the robbers? And the legal scholar that was sitting there with them said, the one who showed mercy. And then Jesus said to him, you go and do likewise. Because mercy and justice rejects passive religion and is intentionally active in people's lives. The second point of doing justice and loving mercy is that it's a faithful presence in somebody's life. And what I mean by faithful presence is it requires proximity to other people. One of my very favorite authors, incredible thinker, now I'm going to forget his name because I said it. I built him up. Henry Nouwen. Henry Nouwen was a theologian. He was a brilliant professor that worked at the School of Divinity in Harvard, and he chose to leave all of that to work with people that had intellectual disabilities and to live in community with them. And one of his quotes says, mercy is the ability to enter the chaos of another and be present with them. Mercy is the ability to enter the chaos of another and be present with them. And as we think about the work of Jesus, that is the ministry that he brought to us. See, sin had created separation between us and God. And the entire story of the Old Testament is God doing justice to this world where he's beginning to restore that broken relationship that existed. And the way that he does it finally is by sending his son. He sent his son to be present with people because mercy and justice requires proximity. We're relational people created by a relational God. This 2 weekends ago, 2 Saturdays ago, our church partnered with other churches in the city to do a thing called Love Where You Live. Love Where You Live is a nonprofit that serves the Schertz communities and cares for the vulnerable people that live there. We do a lot of work for single moms, elderly, for people who are disabled. And largely what it looks like is caring for their property and their homes because they are enabled to do so themselves and often enabled to afford to have somebody else do it for them. And so it's a wonderful way for us to serve our city and to act this out, to be merciful and to show compassion and to love on our neighbors. This last weekend when we were down there, we showed up at this one house, one of our teams did. And this is a common story. We show up at the house and the property hasn't been cared for. The grass is past your hips. It's full of weeds. You can't walk through the yard. There's critters that are living in it. The trees are overgrown. They're falling on the power lines on her side of the property. So if they take the power out, the city is not going to repair it. And so our teams get to work, and they remove 2 trailers full of trash and debris from the property. And as they come to the end of the job, one of the ladies that had been sitting with the homeowner, she was a widow, she was handicapped, she had been sitting there with her, praying with her, ministering to her, hearing her heart, making her feel valued and loved because she was valued and she was loved. She said, "We would love to clean off your patio furniture so you have a place to sit and enjoy this new cleaned up yard." And she said, "Well, I don't have any indoor plumbing." See, every time she turned her water on, that the water lines in her roof on the back of her property were pouring into her home. So the back of her house was just filled with mold and it was falling apart from all the water. And she said, "I actually just turn it on like once a week so I could shower. I turn it on and off at the main out at the street." And so a couple of the guys are like, "We can't leave her like this." And it took them like 2 hours, and all they did is go buy some flex tube, replace the broken copper pipes, and this lady had indoor plumbing once again. There was this other house that we went to. It was actually a really clean house. The lady had been able to mow it and take care of it herself, but her trees were growing into the road. And what happens is the city will find the homeowner because nobody could drive there, and it's their responsibility if the tree's on their lot. So it's pretty simple. We went and cut trees and trimmed them up, and it wasn't a big deal. But all the kids were there. They were picking up tree branches as they fell, and they're loading them up into the trailer. And there was a couple of the ladies that were visiting with the homeowner. Again, she was a single widow, and they're encouraging her. And apparently she had just come out of surgery, and she just had all these laments of life, and they're just loving on her and present with her. And afterwards, she said, "This is what I need in my life. I need a community like this. I need a community that's willing to show up into somebody's life and show compassion and show mercy and to love somebody the way you guys love me. And I want to be part of a community where I could do the same." And she said, "And I want to be part of a community where there's kids that you're training up to do the same things that you're doing." And this is what was great. One of the ladies go, "Well, we would love to have you at Northeast. We love it. It's a great community. It's exactly what you're describing. But also, it's not really just about Northeast. There's a church that's like a quarter of a mile from your house that's partnering with us today. And I think they would love to have you too," that she recognized that there was this bigger kingdom work that was happening. And I don't say that so that we feel good about some work that we did and we went and volunteered for a day. The reason I share those stories is that it took proximity to show up in somebody's life in an act of mercy and an act of compassion. And through that, there was this relationship that developed. And that a lady was invited into a community of Jesus. And another lady had running water because of the proximity of ministry. Because we could have paid somebody. We could have paid somebody to go and to do that work. Probably would have been easier. But we would have missed the opportunity of being present in somebody's life. The third and the final way that we do justice and we love mercy is there's this recognition that it's not always merited. It's not always deserved. Oftentimes, in fact, it's unmerited. Because here's the truth of the matter, that we didn't deserve the mercy that God gave us. I know as I've been reflecting on this week that I didn't deserve the mercy that he gave me. I still don't. And when you search your heart, you know the same thing. That it was unmerited favor in your life. And I think that's why it's such an affront to the gospel when we act without mercy and without compassion. And that's why Jesus was confronting with such strong language, is because that is at the center, at the core of our faith. See, what the Gospels tell us is that when justice and mercy met, unless you've been thinking they're two different things, two sides of the same coin. And when they met, we call it grace. And we've been recipients of grace. And we should also be people of grace. There's this great story of C.S. Lewis. There was a British conference that was happening of comparative religion at Oxford. And the question was, what is unique about Christianity? Not what's true about Christianity, what's unique? What distinguishes it differently from other faiths, other religions? And so Lewis wasn't in the room yet, and all the other academics sat around and began to eliminate possibilities. Incarnation? No. There's other religions that have incarnation. How about the resurrection? Again, no. There's other religions that see the resurrection. And see, for us, we understand that those are shadows of the real thing, but that's not what the question was. The question was, what is unique about Christianity? And Lewis walks into the room and he asks, what is the hubbub all about? What a great way to speak. What a great way to ask a question. And as his contemporaries in the room began to explain to him the debate, he looks at them like, you're missing it. And he says, that's simple. It's grace. It's grace. See, the consequences of our sin are death. That was our fate. Yet Jesus came to bring justice to us, and grace is where justice and mercy meet. That is what Jesus offers. And if you're here today and you have been fed up with bad religion, and you've been wondering if there is a good faith, Jesus says, come to me. I will give you grace. And that's what we have all received too, this unmerited favor. That we're not being called just to only follow all the rules, make our own levels of piety, but that we have been called to be recipients of grace. And as recipients of grace, we are also required to be dispensers of it. And it comes in the form of mercy and of justice. And there's going to be people in your life that do not deserve it. That you're going to look at them and say, how could I forgive them? They don't deserve forgiveness. And Jesus would say, you didn't either. You didn't either. And we're going to look at those people and say, they don't deserve mercy or justice. Look at what they've done. And Jesus would say, you didn't deserve it either. And that, folks, is why we share mercy. That's why we do justice. Even when it's unmerited, because we were recipients of unmerited favor also. And so if you're here today and you've been hurt by a bad religion that has had the wrong priorities, that Jesus would say, come to a good Father and know of a good faith, one that's grace. And if you're here today and maybe there's a repentance that needs to take place, I'll tell you, as I spent the last week in this text, I've felt that. Like I felt my inadequacies in being compassionate and merciful and bringing justice to people. Like I've had to struggle with it, and I hope you have to struggle with it too. And I've had to go, God, forgive me. Forgive me. Because I've been a recipient of grace. I've been a recipient of mercy, that you've done justice in my life that wasn't deserved. Forgive me for not doing the same for others. And if that's you, struggle with that, but take it to the Lord, not in shame, but in confession, and to live your life as a person that does justice and that loves mercy. Let's pray as the worship team comes and we get to respond and worship. God, thank you for your Son. Thank you that you understood there was a proximity, there was a relationship that was in need, and you sent your one and only Son to us. God, we are so humble before you as we show gratitude for your generous justice in our life. God, help this church, help us be known, not by the trivial things that we focus on, not by focusing on the minutia of the matter, but being people that are faithful to you, that walk humbly with you, and that we show people mercy, that we do acts of justice. God, forgive us. Forgive us for the things that we've done, but Lord, largely forgive us for the things that we've left undone, for when we haven't shown mercy, for when we haven't done justice, for when we've received so much and we haven't gave it to somebody else. We love you, God. We thank you that we could come to you in confession and that we can continue to receive your grace in our life. Pray these things in your Son's name, Jesus. Amen.